This morning's high-level panel introduces us to yet another key group, people who are helping communities hit by disasters to recover and rebuild. I look forward to the outcome of this conference. Your work is a top priority for the United Nations, and we will do all that we can to follow up on the results. Reconstruction is the difference between hope and despair. When we support reconstruction, we reassure whole populations that their government and people around the world care about their fate, that normalcy will return, and that they can build back better than ever before. I thank you very much for your attention and wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Deputy Secretary General, thank you very much indeed. Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be here this morning. I'm conscious that we have a lot to get through and a very short time in which to do it. So let me first introduce our panel members and get down to business. Sri Mulyani Indrawati is a former Indonesian finance minister. She's now managing director at the World Bank. Ludger Arnoldussen is a board member at the insurance group Munich Re. He helped establish the catastrophic insurance pool in Turkey after the earthquake in 1999. Marcus Oxley is chairman of the global network of NGOs working in disaster recovery and reconstruction. Kristalina Georgieva is European Union Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response. Lieutenant General Nadim Ahmad is former Deputy Chairman of the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority in Pakistan. And Ato Mitiko Kasa, who is State Minister for Disaster Management and Food Security Sector at Ethiopia's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. He has, of course, huge experience in dealing with droughts, floods, and all manner of man-made and natural disasters. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for coming today. We have no formal speeches. Instead, we have a lot of questions, some of which relate to ongoing disaster interventions, such as Haiti and Japan. And what I'm going to do is divide the discussion into several parts, 3 themes, then a section where we attempt to reach consensus on what needs to be changed, and how, and who will be responsible for it. Huge questions, and as I said at the beginning, we don't have much time in which to do it. There will at the end be a brief summing up by each of the panelists, in which I hope they will explain how they wish to contribute to some of the goals that we've identified this morning. That's the aim. Let's see how far we get with it. Our first theme is entitled, Have We Learned the Lessons of the Past? And we have a short video which we're going to use to introduce that. So if we could have that video now, please.
After disasters, affected countries often experience a major wave of goodwill. Donors, private organisations, individuals, international organisations, all would like to help. A major relief effort is underway. Almost at the same time, planning for recovery and reconstruction needs to start. But how do you do this with so many actors involved? How do you coordinate this with thousands of NGOs and hundreds of bilateral and international organizations?
I spoke to one group in Canada that had water to send to Haiti, and they told me, well, we're going to send it to Red Cross. I said, the Red Cross doesn't need water, Haiti needs water.
In all of this, the voices of the victims are not fully heard.
We don't have no houses. Most of the houses destroyed. Even the houses stand up, people scared to sleep on them.
Governments in advanced economies generally have the capacity to lead the coordination and planning of recovery efforts. But developing countries can be overwhelmed in an already overwhelming situation. Results can be slow, duplication of effort is widespread, and the speed and quality of reconstruction can be jeopardized with lack of proper planning. This inefficiency leads to higher costs, and communities have to wait longer to get back to their regular lives. How can we help countries to make this process work better? Is there a need for better defined arrangements, a better structure, clearer roles and responsibilities?
All right, Minister Kassa, if I could start with you. Problems of coordination voices of victims not being heard, developing countries being overwhelmed by aid. What is not happening, in your experience, that should be happening?
Well, in the Ethiopian experience, disaster risk management has get due attention by the government, the international communities, and the international NGOs. However, it lacks mutual understanding on the multi-agency coordination and action. Therefore, there is a gap in addressing the affected population in areas that are affected in drought and floods.
Who should be filling that gap?
It should be filled first by the line ministry of the government. Second, according to the framework that's set up by the government, it should be filled by the international community. And also the community has to be part in all levels of disaster risk management.
Who in the international community, Kristalina Georgieva, who in the international community is going to look after this issue?
This is a point that we need to all focus very strongly on, that in the immediate aftermath.
Chair, we can't hear very well.
We can't hear you very well.
Well, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to hold this like this.
That's much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for starting with this point. Okay, I need to concentrate on my mic. It is one of the lessons we learned the hard way, that agencies have to come together. The international financial institutions, the government, from our side, the Commission, we all have to participate in a planning process and then be very clear who is responsible for what, and have a division of labor that we then respect, rather than being like 80-year-old playing soccer. You know, everybody is where the ball is, but we don't cover the whole ground. And in this, I would say we have seen in recent years progress, but we still have a way to go. And since you asked,
but you're still saying the same things that have been said in disasters for the last 25 years.
The fact is that now finally there is one planning process, post-disaster needs assessment, where everybody participates.
But it's defective. But it's defective.
And that planning process is actually reasonably effective. What still needs to be done better is, once we have the plan, to stick to implementing it and be there for a long while. And the point where I would say the international community, myself, we all have to be much more diligent, is to bring the right balance between investing in the physical infrastructure, in the things that can be touched and seen, but then also investing in the capacity of the government, in education of kids, in making the transformation of the minds of people that actually would be making countries more resilient to disasters in the long run.
Sri Mulyani, do you agree with that? And if so, what are the formal structures that need to create the environment for that to happen?
Well, the difficulty, I think, related to your original question is actually how to coordinate among the international player, then domestic player, public, private, civil society. And they come with all goodwill, but they come with their own mechanism and procedure.
But
so
again,
I think what you asked about,
this is an old issue.
Exactly,
this is an old issue.
What needs to be done. If we can come up with one framework, a framework in which they will agree when we are dealing with a natural disaster, this is going to be like the template that we can use. Because even I was dealing with tsunami in Aceh, we are quarreling for almost like 3 months only for the procurement process. And it's actually is not really helpful in that kind of situation. So you're asking about very technical framework about who's going to lead. In this case, that means global facility, which the World Bank is managing in this case, can become the forum for us, for the big player, donors, and communicate with civil society in order to actually agree when we are dealing with this situation. The locality is always that if the leadership, local leadership and ownership of the government and institutional capacity is weak, then what kind of mechanism to make sure that safeguard is going to be there? But if they have their own leadership...
Can you answer your own question? What kind of safeguards?
Well,
what kind of structure?
The safeguard is more like an opening up and transparency. Because the skepticism is usually whether the money is going to those who really need it and can be delivered timely. And that's why transparency is there. Because if the government cannot actually convince the donor, then the donor doesn't want to provide the money, then you are going to have a problem, because the one who will be victimized is the people then in this kind of situation. So how you come up with a bridging mechanism in which can be agreed, and that's whether through monitoring. In Aceh, Indonesia at that time was actually also having those heavy skepticism about corruption. So what we are dealing is that establish a good institution, opening up all the process and the transparency, providing with the metric of monitoring so that everybody knows where the money go, how they are doing it, which location, and what is the delivery. I think the transparency can be actually help.
Okay, Marcus Oxley, same issues, same problems, year after year. How do we break through?
Yeah, okay. So I think that poses a question really, is that are we actually learning the lessons from the past? And I think the answer is yes and no. In many ways, if you look at countries which have faced recurrent disasters, it's clear that their levels of emergency response, the preparedness side of things, has actually made progress. But actually, a disaster provides a unique opportunity to break from the past and actually build back better, build back safer, as we capture in those few words. But the real opportunity actually to build back better, build back safer, resides in getting to grips with addressing the underlying causes of risk, which have actually configured the risk in the first place. And that's what we used to call the mitigation side of the DRR agenda. And where we tend to focus on is the preparedness, the response side, and we're never really getting to grips with really understanding what's configuring risk in the first place and what do we have to do to address these underlying drivers of risk, because that's actually what's driving this forward. And I don't think we are learning the lessons from that. And I think there's things that we can do, but at the moment we're not really getting to grips with that.
So what are we not doing that we could be doing?
Well, you know, when we design our disaster recovery strategies, for example, one of the key tools that the likes of the World Bank use is what's called a post-disaster needs assessment. And essentially what they do they go into these countries and we look at where the damage has been done. We look at what infrastructure has been destroyed. And we come up with a recovery strategy that essentially tries to rebuild and reconstruct the things that have been damaged. What we don't really do is do almost a post-mortem of, you know, why is that disaster created the crisis that it has? This is not so much a needs assessment. This is a post-mortem, a critical learning review.
So who needs to do this? Who needs to do this?
Well, I think the national governments are in the ideal position to do that, because ultimately the national governments have the primary responsibility for the recovery of that country, for the rebuilding of that country.
All right.
The international community has to support that.
General Nadeem, would you agree with that?
Actually, I would, go back and clarify one thing. I think when we talk of reconstruction, there are total different set of dynamics which drive reconstruction as against normal development. And therefore, in that background, what we see a mix of strategies by different governments. There are governments which will use the existing line departments to take on the lead on reconstruction, and there are governments which are making dedicated institutions to do the reconstruction. I personally strongly feel that the countries must have fully empowered, functional, and with the legal authority institutions which can take on the reconstruction. So at all the time...
Does Pakistan have that?
Yes. And therefore, they are prepared all the time. They understand the dynamics of reconstruction because this is much fast-paced. It's not work as usual. And therefore, the usual solutions will not work. Secondly, and I will echo the feeling here, that we need to have an agreed framework between the donors, international humanitarian community, and the governments on the long-term sustainable recovery. If you look at the relief or the early recovery stage, you will find that it's very much structured. The UNDAC team will arrive, then UN OCHA will arrive. The UN agencies are very clear as to what they have to do, and under the leadership of the government. This sadly
But we've been discussing this framework for years, haven't we?
No, but this is the time probably to go in and make that framework. Third, you know, different countries have different experiences, and I think this is the time we have a lot of wealth of experience available in different regions. We need to make core groups regionally based to be able to advise the governments which are going through a disaster or a crisis as to how to handle it. Of course, the government will tweak it a little bit in accordance with their own environment, but I think that is going to be critically important to
Okay,
form.
but do we have the right institutions? Do we have the right international institutions? Do we have the right local institutions?
There are dedicated institutions for that purpose in some states and there are actions there. However, there has to be cooperation from the international community and the donors. If we look at the increasing number of disasters in past years in developed and developing countries, there is an alarming trend of disasters which require us to support the states and their institutions. What is it that's not working operationally? I believe that national insurance companies are experts at providing compensation for losses and damages. However, this capacity has not been used enough. So what do you recommend? It will be important for us to raise awareness of risk insurance in Asia. In China and Indonesia, very small percentage of assets are insured. Therefore, we need to spread the culture of insurance in broader scale, despite the financial challenges involved. I would like to raise one point. The lessons from the past may not be enough because the future is going to be more challenging when it comes to disasters and disaster management and crises.
At the same time, so my plea would be we should be thinking for the future in a way that actually this mindset of risk management penetrates across all our institutions. So we have that as a transformative factor of how we all operate. And that, to my mind, is a much bigger theme than just what we have learned from that particular crisis in Haiti or in Pakistan. It is the theme of how, in a world that is getting richer but also more fragile, we can be more agile to face these multiple intertwined crises.
Marcus Oxley, and I'll come to you, Sri Mulyani, in a minute. Marcus Oxley, are NGOs prepared for greater intensity of natural disaster, greater scale?
Well, I think, I mean, I understand that, you know, this climate issue is the big thing on the horizon, but I would say that, you know, disasters always provide unique insights. You know, how we deal with extreme situations always gives us insights into how to deal with more gradual changes. So I don't know whether this is new lessons. So if a country is going to face an increasingly drier, drought-prone climate, then I would say let's look at how societies that are faced by recurrent droughts have managed to cope with that situation. And let's see if we can take some of that learning, how people deal with the extremes, to see how we can deal with the more gradual long-term climatic changes that everybody tells us are ahead of us. So I think there is a lot of knowledge in the system. And I think what we've got to do is find better ways to share that knowledge. And actually, you know, particularly the South-South transfer, because, you know, people learn by doing. And the best people to actually explain and help you learn a new situation are those people who have actually been through it themselves. And people who have been through disasters have that authority of experience, that first-hand learning. And we've got to get that shared laterally instead of always thinking, well, it's about sending knowledge up to the top or the top trying to send knowledge down to the bottom. We've got to get that much greater lateral dissemination.
Sri Mulyani.
We can start from that, in the sense that you talk about framework has been discussed. We are not going to talk in a vacuum. We can discuss based on a case and experience. Let's say why it worked when we are dealing with tsunami in Aceh, why it didn't work when we are dealing in another place. What is work in Pakistan and Haiti? Then you can come up with the real progress on the framework when you're discussing. So it is not just an abstract concept of framework. And then second one, actually each of the institutions have their own strength as well as very specialized in actually offering whether this is funding, whether this is in terms of reconstruction, that can be capitalized. And I think that need to be shared. Who's doing what and what is their strength? So we can capitalize those knowledge, the strength, as well as their ability to operate. And third one, if we are dealing with the local government or the national government, which their capacity is limited, what needs to be done? I think all that's become the learning process. South-South cooperation is one thing, but I think it is not only South-South. Kristalina mentioned about even more on a middle or higher income country, they are not really up to the level of now the variety of disaster that actually can hit any country, whether this is poor or whether they are rich, whether they are small, whether they are big. And so we can actually accumulate and use this learning and knowledge and share it, I think, all with the internet.
Do we have the right institutions to disseminate this knowledge?
We have. Well, the World Bank is actually now saying as a knowledge bank. We've been operating and have a 30 years of knowledge. We are operating in 50 countries with our global facility. We mainstream this risk mitigation and management within the development design. I think yesterday President Yudhoyono in Indonesia said that now the design of their national development will integrate this mitigation and the anticipation of natural disaster, which is repeatedly hit. I think each country have their own mapping of risk, what kind of natural disaster which have a pattern of hitting them. But as Kristalina mentioned, maybe the scale can be increased because the earthquake last time is only 6 scale, now 7, now become 9. And that's become even higher in terms of the requirement for us and the readiness to anticipate that.
General Nadim, we saw in Haiti 58 donors, 8 multilateral organizations, 25 specialist UN agencies, and several thousand NGOs. Is that a recipe for another disaster or for disaster reconstruction?
I think at the moment, Haiti is still grappling with the relief and early recovery. They have not really moved into the reconstruction, which is going to be a minefield for them. And our experience shows if there is a strong institutional arrangement at the government level to coordinate the activities of all the stakeholders who come from within the country, like local NGOs, and who are coming from outside.
But the government may not be up to it.
So in that particular case, I think, I personally feel that UN should take a lead where the government systems are absolutely dysfunctional, rather than another country taking the lead. So this would be a better option for UN to take the lead and coordinate, because otherwise there will be duplication.
That has to be worked out in advance, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely.
You can't wait until the disaster
And I have been
strikes.
saying that for quite some time, that there are 3 different kinds of countries. There are fully developed countries who would not need the assistance of the UN or the donor community at all. There will be countries like Pakistan where you have strong governance, institutional system available, but they would still need foreign assistance to run a large-scale relief or early recovery reconstruction program. There will be countries, some of them in Africa, where probably the government structures may not be strong and they may not have the enough resource wherewithal to run a relief and early recovery program. And therefore, I think the international humanitarian community will have a lead role playing there. But please remember, if you do not coordinate the relief, you will waste billions of dollars. There will be warehouses full of the relief items which will not be utilized.
Wastage, duplication, all that.
Because there is no direction. So if you have a central authority, they will exactly tell you what is needed and where it is needed. Second thing, most of the high visible and accessible areas will be approached by most of the stakeholders. The peripheral areas will be left to nobody. So I think that there is a strong requirement of an institutional system to take this agenda forward.
So the poorest countries have to hand it over to the UN, basically.
If they do not have that managing capacity,
Okay.
I would still go for the government, but if they do not have, UN should play the lead.
All right, Minister Kassa, is that acceptable to you? Would that be acceptable to you in Ethiopia?
I think it is not acceptable in Ethiopia because as much as possible you have to avoid parallel structures and duplication of efforts in order to reach the affected ones in a certain locality or vicinity. To that end, there has to be a coordination mechanism at a national government level. One sector should take the responsibility for the coordination and has to try to bring together all the efforts of the land ministries, the international communities, and the local community as well.
But are you suffering from these problems of duplication and wastage? And
Yeah, it was the case until 2008. Since 2008, we ran business process engineering and tried to avoid such duplication of efforts and parallel structure because we organized.
Have you avoided it? How successful?
Yeah, we
has that
organized
been?
the multi-agency coordination mechanism to bring together the effort of the land ministries, the international community, especially UN agencies and international NGOs, including the local government.
Kristalina, you wanted to say something?
I just want to say that, that there is a need, I mean, I agree with General Nadim, there is a need of a global teams, they may be regionally specialized, that are capable of supporting both the relief effort, but also planning for how you get on a higher level of reconstruction, how you do that. I'm very influenced by two very recent experiences I personally had. One was in March this year, I was supposed to travel to Asia to take part in a simulation of a 7.5 earthquake generating a tsunami that hits Indonesia, simulation. And I did travel to Asia in March, but it was to the real thing. It was to a 9.0 earthquake generating a tsunami and a nuclear accident hitting the best prepared country in the world, hitting Japan, and actually leading to international assistance being necessary for Japan. So that was one. And the second one was visiting the United States and having a discussion with the administrator of FEMA, of the US Emergency Response Agency. And he told me one of his priorities is how to prepare the US to be able to receive assistance when an overwhelming disaster, God forbid, of course, if and when it hits. So I think we are now at the point when, yes, it is absolutely essential for countries to have maximum capacity to deal with their problems on their own. But we also have to build global cooperation in the face of increased frequency and intensity
All right,
of disasters.
so what can the European Union do in this?
What we do in the European Union, two things. One, we are building a European emergency response system, in other words, integrating our own capacity of all 27 member states.
You're building it?
Yes.
When's it going to be ready?
By the end of this year, we are going to have our new European Emergency Response Center, and over time, you would see our disaster response system acting as one. So over the next years, over the next 3 years, actually, to be specific, you would see the European Union being able to act more forcefully as one in the face of disasters at home and overseas. And two, we are very strongly supporting the international organizations that have a global legitimacy to mainstream this, and I'm talking here about the IMF being able to integrate risks in the way they think of macro performance, because these are new risks that can completely change the...
They're not new risks, the intensity may be new, but the risks themselves are not new, are they?
You're absolutely right. The risks are old, but they are presenting now with a much bigger force. And our exposure, because our economic activities are bigger, the population of the world is going to cross 7 billion this year, the impact of those risks are much more damaging. And then global institutions like the World Bank, the regional institutions, they all now have, I mean, there is a new task, and I'm actually very grateful to see Sri Mulyani here, a recognition that this is no more some kind of a special issue. It has to be mainstream for the future of our kids.
Sri Mulyani, yes, and then I want a quick word from Ludger Arnoldson.
I think we have to remind ourselves in many of the occasions, OECD data actually show that the role of international community at the end on the reconstruction stage is actually only around 10%. At the end, it is actually government-owned money who actually deal with this reconstruction, meaning what I picked from Kristalina, that mainstreaming and putting within their own development design, and especially because now the trend of urbanization is there. I mean, many countries going to become urbanized, that become very vulnerable to many of the natural disasters because of climate change. Then mainstreaming within their own development planning or design is becoming very important. And here lesson learned is very important. How we actually redesign so it's become a mitigation rather than actually addressing after or post disaster. I think that's going to be very important.
Okay, Lucas Arnoldson, is the global insurance industry set up to deal with the greater intensity of risks, the greater scale of risks, the huge sums that are now involved compared with 10, 15, 20 years ago?
I think the insurance industry is well capitalized to deal with that. We also make use of the capital markets with innovative financing
instruments. It's good that somebody's well capitalized these days.
Pardon?
I said it's good that somebody's well capitalized these days.
Yeah. I think that...
It's another debate, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I think at the moment the talk in the reinsurance industry is still the industry is overcapitalized. And so I think capital is there enough, but I think we do not see enough demand also from government institutions to cover assets, and I think there would be much more opportunity to do this. It's not happening. And I think the insurance and reinsurance industry is trying to learn from every disaster, because we are betting our money on this. So when we see damages are increasing or something is not working, we factor that into our risk assessment. And I think maybe something like that is needed on an international scale as well, maybe an audit or rating agency for preparedness of countries, so that you have an internationally accepted institution telling a country, you have to do this and this more in being prepared for a disaster that you have to expect. I think we are trying to talk to governments.
That's what you'd recommend?
Yeah, but I think we are trying to do that as a company, talk to governments, but take-up of the idea is still very slow.
Okay. What we're going to do, we're going to move on now to our second theme, which is entitled What You're Promised and What You Get, how to ensure communities get what they deserve. We've got a short video, if we could play that to introduce this session. Thank you.
Financing recovery is very costly. It diverts resources which were meant for development. Generous support from the international community is critical. Often it is uneven and depends on when and where disaster strikes. Not all of the amounts promised come through, and the capacity of international organizations to finance recovery is limited.
We still have more than 1,000 families without homes after the tsunami. We haven't been able to get to the grips of it.
Countries operate and plan without knowing what financial resources will be available to them. Often they do not have the capacity to manage and implement the additional funds for reconstruction. Because of the need to rebuild quickly, there is less control and oversight and a higher risk of misuse of funds. What can we do to provide countries with better systems to manage disasters, as well as more reliable access to reconstruction financing? How can individual and private donations be better integrated and used in the overall financing framework? How can reconstruction financing tap into the resources of the global capital market? And how can we increase the capacity of developing countries to use recovery funds in a timely and efficient manner and for the intended purpose?
Okay, coming out of that, Marcus Oxley, from the NGO's point of view, is donor financing as much of a mess as that video would have us believe?
Well, we've done a lot of work on this issue because, you know, one of the biggest challenges to us is how do you connect these, you know, these macro level inputs coming in? How do you connect that with actually the outputs at the bottom? And consistently what we see is this gap between policies and legislations which undoubtedly is in place at the national level and is actually getting further in place. And we see a gap between the policies and the actual reality on the ground in practice. And what we've learned by talking to the people on the ground, because I think, you know, if we're interested in actually making a difference at the local level, I think we really have to talk to the local institutions who have to execute these policies. So I'm talking about local authorities here, local community groups, local civil society groups. And when we speak to them, it seems to distill down into three critical issues, three critical ingredients, if you like, that translate the policy into practice, that gets the resource in with the output they require. And the three ingredients are around this. The first one is around this whole issue of participation and inclusion. You know, we've got to bring people into the process to connect the policy with the people, and participation inclusion is critical to that. The third one, the next one is around this whole issue about this whole accountability, transparency issue. People have to be aware of what the policies are, of what their entitlements are, who's responsible for what funding is available. The knowledge has to be there to close this gap. And the other one, which came up just in the slide there, is this issue about institutional capacity. There has to be the institutional capacities at the local level to implement. And that's both state and non-state capacities.
So how do you narrow these gaps that you've identified?
Well, I think that's what we've got to invest in. I think we've got to say...
You don't know? There are no answers to this at the moment?
No, there absolutely are answers. There absolutely are answers because, you know, there's a lot of experience out there as to where progress has been made. And out of that, we've distilled down these key issues of accountability, of participation, of local capacity. The problem is we're not investing in that systematically at scale at the local level. And we've got to get that investment down to the local level and create the demand.
So who are you asking to do this? Who specifically needs to do this?
Well, there's a whole series of players at different levels, different institutions that have different functions, which comes from the UN agencies that are at the international level, the international financial institutions, the national...
So it's a coordination issue?
It's coordination, but it's more than that, Tim. It's being clear on what you're trying to deliver. If you're not clear on what the changes you're looking for at the local level, then with all the best will in the world, the policymakers who sit removed from that reality, it's very difficult to understand what the best policy to craft is, what the key issues are, unless it's grounded in the local realities.
Okay, Sri Mulyani, you want to come in here?
The format can be in the form of trust fund. If many donors agree to actually then pooling their resources, and so they can have a better coordination and at the same time simplify the process, and at the same time can establish a much efficient monitoring how effective this fund. But the question also in this case, if we are dealing with a totally different, for example, like NGO who want to operate independently, how you are going to integrate these two? And financing, especially because the theme is on the financing, we actually can innovate with many of instruments. For many small countries like Pacific Island, Caribbean Island, they cannot like deal by themselves. So we can have a pool of sovereign states to actually establish an insurance so that they can have a much better in putting their risk within perspective of economic scale. Second one, we can actually also develop in terms of the contingent. There is an instrument now that we are dealing with many developing countries of dealing with the contingent of economic crisis. How about if we are now developing the contingent based off natural disaster? We did that for many of Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, and so on. I think that can be developed more. So financing will be then immediately available when they are hit by this natural disaster. Third, which is also important, is in the capacity building, is when countries really receive this funding, they can be overwhelmed with the volume. And this is vulnerable.
So it can
and
distort the local economy.
It could not distort, but also in this case, it can be very badly spent. So in this case, the capacity to manage in a very short time. The question is, are we going to substitute national institution and capacity with the international intervention? I think we are learning quite a lot in terms of how we can work together in which we can actually assist without actually crowd out the capacity or building the capacity at the national as well as the local level. I think this is need to be defined more, because we are not going to substitute the national or the local institution.
Okay, General Nadim, you were shaking your head when Marcus Oxley was speaking.
Actually, I think let me just first go back to some basics when we talk of what communities are getting. I think we have here a paradoxical situation. Most of the donors, before really funding a reconstruction program, are looking for 5-6 things. They're looking for an implementation plan from the government. They're looking for an implementation mechanism. They are asking for what kind of fiduciary safeguards will be there, including the accountability system. They're asking for a result-based monitoring and evaluation system. They're asking what will be the complaint redressal system, whether it is systemic.
It's a lot to ask for when a country is on its knees, isn't it?
But all these things have to come from the government. Now, the donor, when you go to the government, he says, unless I know what money I have, I can't plan the reconstruction. So you have a paradoxical situation here. Now, coming to the point of...
So what do you do about it?
No, I think there has to be adjustment between the donor community as well as the government. And I think the donors must come up with flexible funding mechanisms where the government is in the driving seat and not the donors. Let the government take full ownership as well as responsibility. Okay. And it is doable. Okay. Second, I think as far as capacity building is concerned, you will have to run certain capacity building programs. And when you look at the reconstruction, you need some managers, which I think you will find from the market. You will not have everyone in the government. So you'll have to give them sufficient pay packages to attract them to come to you. Second, like in Pakistan, we ran a lot of capacity building programs, training artisans, whether it was masons, electricians, carpenters, steel fixers, and this can be done. What you need is, and there I think there's a strong role for some of the NGOs who have the requisite experience to do a kind of an oversight to make sure that the things are happening in the right way. Whereas it will be like supported by the government monitoring and evaluation systems as well to make sure that the reconstruction is delivering on the right track and the impacts that we are wanting are getting created. But when we talk of reconstruction, I want to also highlight that I think it's not brick and mortar alone. We need to look at the soft side of the reconstruction also. Are we improving on the service delivery? Are our schools, our water supply schemes, or our health facilities are delivering better than before? So if we meet that bill, probably we are coming out in a successful reconstruction program.
I want to stay with the finances and just go to Kristalina for a moment. I mean, this catch-22 situation for these countries. They need to know how much money is coming in order to plan, and the governments need all kinds of requirements from them.
Yes. I mean, I grew up in socialism, and at that time there was a saying, we are all equal, but some are more equal than others. And I think this saying applies to disasters. Not all disasters are born equal. There are mega disasters. And I think when we talk about mega disasters, there has to be three things have to change. The first thing that needs to change is a recognition that in a case of mega disaster, governments have to organize for a long-term reconstruction, and that may mean setting up a national reconstruction agency, but secondly, as we heard, donors have to organize to provide funding predictably for a long time. Just in brackets, 5 years is nothing when we talk about Haiti reconstruction. The time horizon has to be 10, 15, 20 years. And the third thing that needs to change, and I would be joyful in the day that changes, is that if you have a pledging conference for a mega disaster, you must have a reporting, stock-taking conference in 5 years and in 10 years. And look at what has been achieved. And unless we get in this culture of accountability over a long period of time, we would be talking about the same issue.
Okay,
over
we're
and
talking
over
about
again.
accountability. Who's got to bring in these changes? Who do you recommend produces this change
Obviously-
of mindset?
Obviously, this is all of us. It is an obligation of the government's public sector to recognize the world has changed, and especially in the 30 to 40 countries that are most prone to disasters, that has to be institutionally recognized. International organizations have to make that a rule. You cannot go to enthusiastically to a pledging conference, for example, on Haiti, but when the cameras are gone, commitments kind of evaporate in thin air. This is absolutely unacceptable. So that, and then of course, civil society accountability. You're the guys that have to keep us all prudent. And I think this idea of international agency that looks into the risks and it looks into performance vis-a-vis risks, this is something that we should be debating. It might be a necessity for us.
Minister Kassa, have you experienced the gaps in the funding coming in and getting to the people who need to have it in your country, in Ethiopia? Have you been experiencing that?
Right. Let me tell you the life example of Ethiopia. The experience has shown that we have been able to secure 60% for food and 50% for the non-food components from what we appealed, let alone the recovery and the reconstruction, because we have to save the lives and livelihoods of the community. So it is clear that we are not in a position to finance the recovery as well as the reconstruction appeal of the community and the government, because we have to think and put the attention how to fill and bridge this financial gap, because the international community should see their financial release mechanism, because they have no flexible financial windows to invest and finance for the recovery and the rehabilitation. It begins with the mental setup or the attitude, because all international committees focus on emergency response, but it should go beyond the emergency response.
Something you keep saying to them, presumably.
Yeah, it has to
and
cover...
what response do you get when you say this?
Response?
From the international community?
Because there is the intention to reduce the cost. Because as we all know, the recovery and the reconstruction components of the disaster risk reduction are very costly, because nobody wants to invest on this costly operation. My suggestion is it is better to look at the whole component of disaster risk management, from prevention to the reconstruction part of the intervention.
Lucas Arnoldussen, this is your area. You have to become much more creative in the financial instruments that you offer to countries. I mean, you were deeply involved in the reconstruction effort in Turkey after 1999. Is that a model that you can extend elsewhere?
I think it is one possibility to do that. I would like to take up a point that was mentioned before, creating certainty for countries and individuals what funding is available for the reconstruction. The whole funding mechanism internationally reminds me of the situation before fire insurance was established in Germany a few hundred years ago. If your house burned down, you got a letter from the local ruler saying the house burned down, he's allowed to beg around for money to rebuild his house. And this is also happening with these conferences on an international scale. I think the alternative in Germany was to establish compulsory insurance. So you, as an individual, think about your risk and buy the insurance, and then you have certainty what you get when you have a claim. And I think that model could be introduced on an international scale. And I think what I'm surprised about is that donor organizations are not using insurance. I think there's a certain reluctance to take donor money and put it in an insurance cover, maybe for the Caribbean or for the Pacific Islands, if something happens. And then you really have a big amount available, and nobody has to sit together or drum up support for donors. So I think this is still, I think, a very, very old-style mechanism that we are using on an international scale. And the bigger disasters become due to climate change, the more inadequate this mechanism will be, I think.
And what about access to capital markets in future? Better access to capital markets.
I think the instruments are there, and especially for scenarios that are not US hurricane or European windstorm, the really big scenarios. I think there would be ample capacity in the capital markets and in the reinsurance industry for this. But at the moment, the demand is not there, because people in Pakistan or Indonesia cannot afford to buy this. And I think this is where the international effort has to come in.
So how do you incentivize countries in the way that you've incentivized Turkey, for instance? I mean, do you have 2 million people now who've insured their homes through the scheme that you helped set up, their homes, their property?
Yeah, I think there are two ways. You can incentivize people by subsidizing insurance premiums, giving tax breaks, but I think the more rigid method would also be, and that was applied in Germany a few hundred years ago for fire insurance, compulsory insurance cover. You have to buy insurance cover.
How would that work in Pakistan, General?
It would be difficult. I think principally we all agree that this risk transfer mechanism is the right way to go, because every time we're seeing the frequency of disasters increasing alarmingly, and every time you can't put the entire reconstruction bill onto the government or to the donors, so there has to be some risk transfer mechanism. But when I look at the people who get affected, mostly they belong to poor areas. They're already vulnerable, really struggling for 2 square meals a day. And if you ask them to give, take insurance to protect their crops or livestock or their housing, then we are asking them too much. So probably there has to be a lot of advocacy at the field level for people to really know what are the benefits and advantages of the system. And also for the initial few years, I think we will need some capital coming in from the donor communities to cover for at least the first 5 to 10 years if a disaster comes, that the money comes from elsewhere, till this catches up. I think we have to build a mass and a momentum towards this direction. Principally, I am for this idea, but there are some implementation difficulties to really go through this.
Okay, all right. Well, that moves us rather neatly into our next theme, which is entitled Prevention Pays. So why are we not investing? And we have a brief video to introduce that part of the proceedings. So if we could have the video, please.
The social impact of natural disasters can be significantly reduced. The economic consequences can be better managed. In Bangladesh, for example, in 1991, 138,000 people lost their lives when the Bangladesh cyclone hit. Since then, Bangladesh has invested in early warning systems, cyclone shelters, and built a volunteer system for rapid evacuation. Thanks to these efforts, the number of deaths has been drastically reduced. During Cyclone Sidr in 2007, 3,400 died. Turkey is another example. After the Marmara earthquake in 1999, the country established an insurance scheme which transfers the financial risks of earthquakes to the capital market. Today, over 2 million families have their homes protected by this insurance. The big question is, how do we develop incentives for prevention to motivate countries to invest in a safer future, beginning with disaster recovery and reconstruction?
Sri Mulyani, you're a former finance minister of Indonesia. What relevance does this scheme have for you?
Well, the prevention is paid, but many countries not really adopting it, sometimes because of their own capacity or the vision, whether the nature of the natural disasters should be put within their own development planning. So definitely there are huge opportunity for the institution like World Bank, Regional Development Bank to actually assist many countries in order to internalize the design of their own development, especially on I will emphasizing this in urban design, because the trend of urbanization is there, but it's not excluded for the need, for example, like rural area and even in this case the population which is close to the sea. I think another thing is that why it is not really putting more investment on prevention is because of the recognition of the risk as well as the ability of really designing the consistent system. The third one is actually related to the ability to use all the international support not only when the disaster hit. And that's why what is actually discussed here, actually the need to invest by the international community, not only during the crisis or the disaster happened, but before that. And that's
and
already—
is that not happening?
No, it's happening now. There are quite a lot of funding which is related to the climate change, in which we actually assist a lot of countries to adapt to this climate change challenge, and that's actually related to that. On the IDA funding, we are now having the window especially actually designed for this natural disaster. We are not going to invest for the post-disaster, but the pre-disaster, in which then it is related to their own design and the ability to mitigate with the risk. So I think there are quite a lot of innovation, but at the same time also an engagement by international community like World Bank, Regional Development Bank, and international financial institution, which they then look at this as the risk, which is like a risk like food crisis, fuel price, economic and financial crisis. Now we are dealing with this natural disaster and climate change. That is already now put within the context of the national economic plan.
Okay, Marcus Oxley, any of the recommendations that you've heard going to help narrow the gap that you identified earlier, the gaps?
Yes, I mean, I certainly think, you know, the issues around accountability, transparency, making sure that the funding coming in actually gets down to where we want it to go. I think that's definitely part of it. But I also think the debate is perhaps a little bit too narrow in that the investment is not just in finance. Do you know, I was doing some research for this discussion actually, and I read a speech that Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, made. And he was talking in the Middle East on the back of the recent changes there. And he was saying, you know, that he called the speech a new social contract for development. And he was talking about this social contract, this relationship between states and citizens. And to me, this, you know, when we say here a long-ignored development challenge, I think this resonates with a speech that the president of the bank made when he was saying that actually it's this relationship between states and people and issues of inclusion and participation and local democracy and local institutions that can, you know, engage people in being part of the development processes of the countries.
It's good, you know, rhetoric, but what does it actually mean?
Exactly. It was a visionary speech. But the problem is that unless you have a hard strategy to execute vision, it's just a daydream. And what we've got to do is we've got to recognize the core principles that the president of the bank was saying were critical to this social contract, and we've got to invest in those principles. And that's as much about trust, dialogue, relationship building, mutuality, partnerships, as it is hard cash. Because that's how we get the return on the hard cash. That really is the return in the investment.
And how the money is put to use at the coal face where it's needed.
That's right.
Kristalina, no shortage of fine words in the EU. How do we get it down to the coal face, to the people who need it?
In the EU, we actually also are victims to this trend of increased natural disasters. Some 100,000 people died in the European Union in 10 years as a result of disasters, and the vast majority, by far, is due to floods. This is our biggest risk. We have offered to our member states structural funds for flood management. And guess what? Of the money we have offered, disbursement in this area is well below the average disbursement of EU funds for roads and for agriculture. And the question is why? And what we believe is happening are three things, and these are three obstacles to eliminate. The first one is there are vested interests. Some of these resilience measures are good for the society, but may mean that somebody cannot build somewhere or land has to be taken over for flood protection purposes. Second, there isn't a strong disincentive for not doing it. In other words, if you don't invest in flood management, there is no conditionality, nothing hits you. Like if floods hit you in Europe, you can get Solidarity Fund money to help you. We have not made it a condition that you do the right thing in disaster preparedness and prevention, and only then you can get Solidarity Fund money. And the third
so it's no good telling the rest of the world how to do it when you don't do it yourself.
Well, you know, we are learning for the benefit of full disclosure. Of course, we are also learning. And the third thing that I think needs to change is that we have to have a way to monitor progress on disaster preparedness, on risk reduction. And that is actually a theme we have talked a little bit about, the necessity of some kind of global standards that tell us what is our risk, I mean, how we measure whether we are reducing this risk, and so we can then measure the effectiveness of these investments better. In the EU, I'm very proud to be an European, I'm very proud for the EU. One thing that I want to say is that in the EU, at least, we recognize that climate change is by far the biggest challenge that our kids are going to face. We have made the commitment to tackle climate change or mitigation, and we are more and more in the EU recognizing that the train has left the station. Mitigation is very important, but we also have to adapt, and that in the EU, I think, is a platform in which we are and we will exercise leadership, including by honestly stating what we do well, what we don't do well, how we can improve.
Okay, General Nadeem.
Yeah, let me, go back to, again, basics. You need to understand that I think principally no one will disagree with this, that the prevention pays. But when you go to the governments, they have other agendas which are higher on the priority list. There are issues of price hike, economic meltdowns, war on terror, law and order, and name it. And when you go back to them and say, you know, we need to do this, they say, please let us sort out these things and then we'll come to this prevention phase. Second, again, structural issue. This is a cross-cutting theme. All the line ministries doing the hard part, the communities doing the soft part. This has to go hand in hand, both the structural and the non-structural prevention. Now, if there was one single agency with a dedicated responsibility of ensuring that prevention is done, then probably it was possible.
That's what you're advocating?
Yes, but when you, for example, in the National Disaster Management Authority, we made 2 laws. We made sure that the government makes the building bylaws which are multi-hazard resistant. It has taken us more than 2 years to get it really implemented and enforced. We have included in the syllabus for the Education Ministry disaster management chapters in books from class 1 to class 12. We have not been able to get it printed because when you go to these ministries, they have so many other things to do. So they are more focused on their primary tasks rather than to look at whether prevention is paying or not. So I think these are 2 structural issues. Third issue is that I think there is not so much of advocacy on parts of the donors. For example, in the floods of Pakistan, I was talking yesterday, we spent more than $2 billion on relief, and we're going to spend $10 billion plus on reconstruction. If I had put in only $47 million in protecting the flood dikes, I wouldn't have to spend $12 billion. So I think the donors are also not putting that kind of emphasis on the prevention part or the ex-ante part.
So your top recommendation for getting money from donors to where it's needed?
It has to be multi-track. It has to be multi-track. It has to come from the donors. It has to come from the international organizations which have so much of knowledge available to them on about how the prevention pays. It is to be the governments have to be sensitized to keep it high on the agenda, and this will come by creating vibrant advocacy groups. And these advocacy groups must come from the civil society, the communities, the media, the parliamentarians, the donors, the NGOs.
Okay, well that was at least 10 recommendations. Sri Mulyani.
Well, the problem
Top recommendation for getting money from donors to people who need it.
Well, exactly. The demand from countries in the world is always exceeding the ability to mobilize the fund. And that's why, first, of course, you can use the facility, like in the bank, we manage the global facility for disaster and reconstruction. We also have this IDA fund, but I bet that even if we use all those money, we're not adequate to actually fulfilling the demand, even for the prevention. Now, the question is actually how you are going to combine the international goodwill as well as initiative with the own government budget. Of course, it is always competing, but if we can actually show that investing on a prevention is going to be much, much more benefiting for their own good,
that's your priority.
then it's become the priority.
Investing
because, yeah, exactly. Because you talk about all the priority from education and so on.
Okay.
But if you build the same school and then it can be destroyed easily, then actually you are going to do the same thing again and again.
Okay, Ludger Arnoldussen, and then I'll come to Kristalina. Top recommendation for getting money from the international community to the people who need it. Top recommendation.
I think the point that Kristalina mentioned is important to combine. I think giving money with also requirements of what to do for prevention. And there must be a sort of penalty for that as well if you're not doing that. I think we have to move this up the agenda of the government.
It's going to be very difficult to enforce, isn't it?
I'm sure.
Let's face it. Mr. Casa, very difficult to enforce any penalties, isn't
I
it?
think
That's cool.
prevention is a key for developing countries, especially for Africa, because most disasters, hazardous, especially drought and flood, are associated with the natural environment. So if we are able to work on irrigation scheme, we can avoid disasters that resulted from a drought. If you are working on reforestation, because most of the cases are flash floods that are associated with deforestation cases. So if we are working on reforestation, we can avoid flash floods. And also we have to develop urban development schemes like drainage systems in urban areas, because in Africa, urbanization is emerging and fast growing. So we have to think to divert the situation in African continent. So we have to establish the multi-donor trust fund to finance.
A trust fund?
Trust fund to finance on prevention schemes.
Okay, Kristalina.
I just wanted to say that not all preventive measures are expensive, are high cost. There are very many low cost, incredibly effective measures like good weather forecasts or alert systems in the case of disasters. And my recommendation to the donors is to fund across the board, help implement these programs on a global scale. We should have good weather forecasts everywhere, but especially in highly vulnerable countries, and it is not very costly. The returns on a dollar or euro spent in good weather forecasts are somewhere around 15 to 20 dollars, euros, whatever you take. And we should work across the board very aggressively on alert system as the one that we saw in Bangladesh.
Okay.
There is no excuse not to do that.
How much donor fatigue are you seeing now?
In this one, it is not so much a matter of fatigue, it is more a matter of sticking to priority.
But there is donor fatigue, isn't there?
Oh, well, I mean, I wouldn't call it.
Otherwise people would get the money that's been promised. And they're not getting it, are they?
May I profoundly disagree with that? Opinion surveys in Europe, I'm talking about my guys, Europeans. Opinion surveys in Europe show that Europeans, 8 out of 10, are in favor of humanitarian aid, helping people in need.
But how many governments don't live up to the pledges that they make? Quite a few.
Pretty much the same percentage of people are in favor of development cooperation. The only thing people ask for is accountability for results. And I think we would never have donor fatigue if we are clear in telling the stories of what money do. And actually, the citizens, I'm looking over there to the civil society representations, the citizens have to make sure that governments actually stick to the commitments they have made. We have made the commitment 0.7% GDP for development. We're not there yet. We have to get there, and we also have
why
to
aren't you, Why aren't you there?
I think we are not there because what has happened is this commitment was made at a time when the world was hit by the worst economic and financial crisis since the Second World War. It does have implications on austerity in countries, and I think there are so many. There are so many problems that pop up here, there, and everywhere that we have difficulty to focus our attention on achieving a commitment of this nature.
Okay,
but
I think Marcus Oxley wants to raise a couple of issues with you there. But I'd like to hear how many countries fall short of their pledges.
I don't know. I can't answer that. You'd have to. I mean, I can answer your question about what will be the one single thing I would do to get the money at the top down to the bottom. If you give me a... Okay. Well, as a taxpayer into the international donor system, I think that I would ask for a, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, I would ask for a transparent and impartial monitoring system that can look at the financial inputs going in at the national level, at the macro level, and I would make sure that that monitoring system also measures the outputs and the outcomes at the local level and make sure that it has indicators at that local level. And I would see if the inputs going in correlate with the outputs at the grassroots level.
Who would you like to set up that mechanism?
Well, I think that's going to have to be a joint action between all the different institutional scales that are involved in this, from the international, the regional, the national to the local, and there's got to be engagement at the local level, involvement of local communities, because ultimately they are in the best position to judge whether these investments are actually building safer lives, more resilient livelihoods for them. They are the primary
you really see such a
stakeholder
body
in this.
coming into existence? You really see such a body coming into
It's, why not? Why not? Where there's a will, there's a way. We can absolutely do this if we think this is a critical issue. If we think this issue about clear transparency, clear accountability, measuring inputs, correlation with outputs, and if I was designing a global adaptation fund, which is possibly going to be the biggest single source of external funding that actually can build resilience at the local level, because actually climatic resilience at the local level is very, very similar to disaster resilience at the level. If I was in the powers that be, was designing that adaptation fund, then absolutely I will be saying you need a monitoring system in place that can measure where that external funding goes, if it correlates with outputs, and get those local baselines down now. Because if you don't put those local baselines down, then it's a hypothetical discussion you have. Okay. We've got to lay that down now.
Okay, very briefly, and then I want to take some questions from the floor.
On this point, I think most of the donors do have their independent oversight and evaluation systems in place. Follow it up with the national monitoring and evaluation system, and you can always ask for third-party evaluations through market-based firms. So it should not be a big issue to make sure that the amount that has been donated is spent transparently and the output is what you expected.
Okay, okay. We're going to take some questions from the floor. You have, I think, microphones on each of the desks there. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Gentleman over there, can you get to a microphone on the desk? Is there one there? Yeah, and then we'll come to you over there.
I'm Dr. Baloch from Pakistan. We are talking about responding
Sorry,
to that.
I can't understand. If you can put the microphone just a little closer to you.
I would like to draw your attention that we must have some capacity building for to respond natural disasters. There should be some public or private institutes where you train some people, maybe short training, maybe long trainings, so that they have their own internal capacity to respond to the natural disasters. That can be under the aegis of the national disaster management authorities or the authority infrastructure developed by the government. But there should be some correlation between those authorities receiving donations and then implementing those policies. So what I wish to draw that whenever there's I come from the institute where we have started some 6 months training course for the disaster risk management. The response is good, but it's a private institute. We cannot afford to go to enroll many more people. Okay. At the same time, we want our faculty to be trained from time to time.
Specific question?
Yes. Question is that government or the policymakers must have some component reserved for funding those institutes who are imparting the disaster management, disaster risk management education. That's my question, my suggestion.
Sri Mulyani.
Civil society directly, in this case, need to have one financial scheme. You mentioned about the civil society. Among the civil society, they can actually work together. But even the bank now, because I'm picking up the speech from Bob Zulik on this building the social trust, I think there are quite a lot of initiative has been done in order to be able to support the civil society, because they are the strength in terms of demanding whether this is related to good governance, accountability, and so on. So here is actually not only for demanding for the good governance and so on, but also the ability of society to learn each other, or to learn from generation to generation the wisdom of actually live with this risk of natural disaster. Second one, I think, it is actually come from many bilateral support. My experience with Aceh in this case is actually a lot of bilateral support is actually really focusing on capacity building and dealing directly with society. So in this case, the bank can mobilize and facilitate that. South-South cooperation is there. And even in this case, the big NGO can facilitate this kind of learning process. So in a way, responding to that, yes, the role of the civil society, or the people in this case, to have their own initiative, to train, to understand the risk, and then to develop a certain risk mitigation is there, and there are a lot of initiative has been done. And for Pakistan in this case, this actually can be put within the package of the flood support, the flood and risk mitigation, which is actually designed with many of the multilateral development bank. So within that, we can put a certain package or component of dealing with the civil society.
Okay, there was a gentleman over there, and then we've got three more questions.
May I give a comment, or I can ask questions? Can I give a comment, or I have to ask questions?
We prefer a question, actually.
I'll give a comment and then I give a question.
But if you've got a brief comment, we'll allow that.
I think international agencies, after a disaster, come with certain agenda to reconstruction of the damaged area, and mainly the physical reconstruction. And this process, in some cases, caused the tsunami of reconstruction disaster. What I mean, what is needed to be reconstructed is what has caused the damage due to the disaster, which is what has caused because it was a lack of implementation of existing and available know-how or ABC of the engineering principles. What we need to reconstruct, the building the capacity that can be able, make countries become able to implement the know-how in order to avoid the future disaster. Okay. When we are reconstructing in one area, the construction of bad construction are going on in another area. Therefore, my question is...
All right, okay. General Nadeem, do you want to react to that?
I think the point that you make is absolutely valid, that when you're looking at reconstruction, it has to be multi-hazard resistant if possible, and look at both sides, the structural mitigation and also the non-structured, where the communities are prepared. So I think nobody will disagree with that point. But I think I will take that part with a pinch of salt, that they come with their own agendas and they do own type of things. I think if there's a strong institutional government structure available, that will make sure that all such malpractices do not happen.
Okay, we had some questions here. Gentlemen, yes, you.
Hello. My name is Sailesh Secretariat for the RICS Disaster Management Commission.
Sorry, could you go a bit closer to the
Sure.
microphone?
The key question that I had was linked to the title, effectively. Responding to natural disasters, long ignored development challenge. Much of the discussion you had focused a lot more on response, risk transfer. The key question I would have is, I wonder if the debate could focus a little bit more, or at least the answers could focus a little bit more on the development challenge, the linking to the chronic poverty, the linking to the areas which challenge political situations, political structures, vested interest, the issues like land tenure or building back better, issues related to land.
She's going to say something on that.
I was sitting here thinking that one thing we haven't talked about is that the best way to increase resilience is through development. Just compare Haiti and Chile. In Haiti, 7.2 earthquake killed over 250,000 people. In Chile, 500 times stronger earthquake, 8.8 earthquake, killed 800 people. 800 too many, but still, what makes the difference? Of course, a very high degree of development, institutional capability. So when we talk about building resilience, we should not lose sight that the very best way to build resilience is by building the economies, the educational systems, the capacity of countries to actually be stronger. But I thought that it was good that our discussion talked about this aspect, because in a sense what we were saying is that this dimension has to be integrated in mainstream development, and that is what has not yet happened, and we have to push at all levels, international, in donor programs, nationally, locally, so it would happen. But yes, an excellent question. Thank you very much for it.
All right, there was a very briefly, yes.
I think you make a good point. But please remember, when you talk of reconstruction, we're talking of building back better, and essentially that means upgradation and safe facilities. We are mainstreaming gender, environmental safeguards. We are looking at social protection, especially the vulnerable people. And we are also looking at poverty reduction, because when you are looking at large-scale reconstruction, a lot of money goes into that area. But some of the perennial problems of, whether the politics of it has been right or not, probably cannot be sort of brought into the realm of reconstruction in the manner that you are thinking. Somewhat, yes, but not totally. That's, I think, a much longer objective, which should be sorted out by some different forums, not the reconstruction.
Okay, all right, this gentleman there.
Mohamed Tabiwi from Morocco. My question to the development agencies. So we know...
Could you go a bit closer to the microphone?
Okay, sorry. So we know that there is a big link between development and risk management. Development agencies give money, like lending or whatever, donations to set other projects like in agriculture, education, and so on, investment projects too. So is on the agenda of these development agencies to link between these projects and risk management, because there is a huge link. We should build on this project to emphasize the risk management in countries, developing countries.
Lucas Arnoldussen, do you want to take that?
Could you just summarize it once again?
Linking between the development and risk management.
Yeah.
Disaster and risk management.
Yeah.
I think this is a very valid point, and I think we need to involve all parts of society in this and raise the awareness within the people, but also use the capabilities in the country. Again, I would recommend insurance industry as somebody whose job it is to manage risks, especially on the property side where we are talking here. And I think it is really striking in countries where you have a better developed risk management attitude, you see better performance in recovery, and also you see more of learning after a disaster and implementing changes straight away afterwards. And I think it's also quite important discipline in enforcing standards that you have on the building side, for instance, that you have understood to be beneficial from a risk management perspective. In many cases, it's not happening. If you take Haiti, there were, before the earthquake, I think there were wonderful concepts for low-cost housing, earthquake-proof, using simple things like car tires in the foundations of the houses. It was not applied. It was not applied, and you risked so many lives.
Why not?
I don't know, but it was there and it was not used. And I think it's also a matter of how capable a government is, how strong the position of a government is in enforcing things like that, and how far up is it on the agenda. I think that is always a point.
Yeah, I think in terms of making sure that there is a link between this development design and the risk management, we can always do it in the 3 level, and this is what already implemented in the bank. Policy level, just make sure that the design, whether you are talking about project or program, in this case, is going to integrate it there. Second one, on operationalizing. And this is very important because you can have a good policy but cannot be then implemented. So operational guidance, our guideline, should really reflecting that policy goal can be implemented. And third one is most important, is actually monitoring, evaluation, and then feedback to this policy again. That is the 3 cycle. Now, for the bank, and especially engaging with many of the member countries, we don't want this to be just a checkbox that, yes, you have a policy of risk mitigation there. You have gender, yes. You have a good governance there. I mean, you can always like mainstreaming, and then it will be translated only into document, but not really operationalizing, and it really affecting the people. And that's why it's very important to have this engagement, talking about inclusiveness and the feedback from the civil society, whether the policy design, the operationalization, as well as the effectiveness of the output and outcome can be really enjoyed by the people. The last thing I would like to also reiterate here is that with the technology communication, which is now very advanced, Facebook and all those Twitter and so on, actually feedback can be received in a faster, efficient, and less costly. So that can actually be designed in terms of the way each institution, development institution work, so you can get the fast response from that feedback.
Okay, Marcus Oxley.
Yeah, I think I think the way I would see disaster risk reduction is that essentially good disaster risk reduction is good development in a hazard-prone region. And that development can be agricultural development, water development, social economic development. And I would say it's good development in a disaster-prone region in the context of an increasingly changing climate. That's the challenge we've really got to get to grips with. And I think the way forward to learn from this is see experience as our greatest asset here. But experience is only your greatest asset if you learn from that experience. And that means, as Shailesh alludes to, it's about understanding what are the causes that are configuring this risk in the first place is the only way really to get ahead of the disasters curve. And at the moment we're still a little bit fixated with the effects of the disaster instead of really trying to understand what are the underlying causes that are driving this. And that's a deep-rooted developmental challenge. That's the problem. Because a development challenge is not politically neutral. People have already mentioned issues about land issues, about redistribution, about greater accountability, about decentralization of resources. These are not politically neutral issues. There are winners and losers in this. There's strong vested interest in this. This is as much a political challenge as it is a financial challenge. Disaster preparedness, disaster response in many ways is politically neutral.
So how would you attack this?
Well, I think one of the golden opportunities that comes in a disaster is that people's attitude towards risk changes. That the Japanese people's attitude towards the safety of nuclear power plants, and perhaps the global attitude to the safety of nuclear power plants, has probably changed in the aftermath of what's happened in Japan. 20 million people who were affected by flooding in Pakistan have probably changed their attitudes towards disaster risk. And it's attitudes which drives practice. So there is a golden opportunity that comes here, if only we could capitalise on it. And I'm not sure we are doing.
Okay, gentleman over there.
Earlier, General Nadeem made a valid comment, I thought, about capacity building in Pakistan and the need for that. My organisation, REDAR, works on capacity building programmes in Pakistan, among other countries, and institutional donors are telling us that this is not a priority right now to fund. So my question to the panel is, how do we change this rhetoric from the need for capacity building to support for capacity building?
General Nadeem, you want to come back on that?
I think the point that you make is absolutely valid. I understand that at least the international financial institutions do have a technical grant associated with every assistance package that they offer to the government for capacity building. Now, most of this capacity building, of course, is being done within the government sectors and some of the NGOs. I think there are ways where the REDAR and other NGOs can tap into some technical assistance grants by the donor community to run these capacity building programs. It's only, I think, the information and the knowledge may not be there that such grants are available which can be utilized.
Okay, Kristalina, you wanted to make a point.
It is very important for assistance programs to recognize the investment in capacity building, so when the next disaster hits, the needs are smaller. In the European Commission, we made a decision to dedicate funds in disaster-prone countries exactly for capacity building at community level, and we track how much we spend. We don't have an explicit target because we believe that targets are a bit artificial, but today I can say that between 6 and 7% of humanitarian assistance from the European Commission goes for capacity building in disaster preparedness at community level in most disaster-prone areas. And I think we need to make this an objective to track how much we do and report and make sure it is proportionate with the needs. So as the needs change, that may have to increase.
Okay, in the few minutes we have left, I just want to draw together some of the threads of the discussion and ask each of our panelists, based on the discussion that we've had this morning, what will they take away and attempt to do differently, and what kind of different contribution they feel they may be able to make as a result of this discussion. Marcus Oxley, one thing.
Yeah, I mean...
Give us a commitment to do something differently.
Well, I mean, as the chair of a global network of civil society groups, what my commitment really is to try to get the priorities, the needs, the concerns of the primary stakeholder in this whole process into that policy discourse. So get the voice, get the participation, get the engagement with the people at the front line.
How will you seek to do that?
Sitting on chairs like this and talking to the likes of people who are working in different institutional levels, bringing the evidence base from the front line, the strong irrefutable force of evidence that says these are the key actions which will translate policy into practice, and advocating that, amplifying that, and making the connectivity between the local, the national, the regional, the international, because only by working together on joint actions and collaborative shared objectives are we going to achieve a change that we need to achieve at the local level.
Aren't you afraid we'll be saying exactly the same thing in 5-10 years' time?
I am afraid. Yes.
Yeah. General Nadeem, how do we avoid having this conversation? I mean,
so I'm not going to go.
The great problem with growing old is that you remember discussions you had 25 years ago.
No, but I think
I remember asking some of these questions 25 years ago. So
I'm going to give you some practical things, and I'm sure we are not going to repeat it 10 years hence. First and foremost, I think we can make strong national institutions who should take the lead on this agenda, both ex ante and post-disaster. Second, I think we need to have an agreed framework between the donor, humanitarian community, and the governments on sustainable recovery programs.
A new framework.
New framework, and I'm willing to chip in. with whatever little I know. Third, I think we also need to create a core group of experts, regionally based, to be able to help countries wherever disaster strikes. Take these 3 things from me, and these are all practical, and we can start doing it right from tomorrow.
Okay, Sri Mulyani, thank you very much.
Well, I think picking up from the recognition that framework is important has been discussed 25 years. So what we could do now and to make it effective, I think then we call for international institutions as well as government, which they've already quite a lot of establishing their own national capacity building. This need to be built based on that.
But when you go back to Indonesia, what are you going to tell them to do?
Well, we call it BNPP, Badan Penanggulangan Bencana, that is the body that institution addressed for reconstruction and rebuilding. I think they can share with many of the national entity like that. And you mentioned about knowledge which need to be shared. I think there are quite a lot of ability to facilitate this learning process and learning from the lesson which
Does
is
it need a new
successful
mechanism to spread that knowledge?
Oh, there is a lot of mechanism exist now which we can develop and build from that South-South cooperation, which is built on more like economic cooperation, can be expanded.
So you do existing things better?
Yeah, well,
rather than new
or
institutions?
adding up to the agenda or topic in which natural disaster is an inherent and built-in development issue. So it is not going to be separate window, separate issue. It's become integrated within the development.
Kristalina.
Okay, slight deviation. Many of you may have heard this story. This is a problem of governance we are discussing. The story is how we can
You're
fix...
coming to a commitment, are you?
I will in the end.
Please, we don't have long, so
well,
the end must be near.
If we talk... Okay, let me go to that. There are 2 ways to fix global governance. One is realistic, the other one is fantastic. The realistic one is extraterrestrials comes from space, they take over, they fix our problems, and the fantastic is we people do it ourselves. Now, my commitment is very simple, that actually I do believe time has come for us to integrate, to mainstream, as Sri Mulyani said, to integrate in existing governance arrangements at global level, the global institutions, at regional level, like in the EU, at national and at the local level, to integrate risk management better. And for that, I think discussions like this are actually really good fora to bring specific ideas so we can take them
And you're
home.
an influential person in the EU, and you're going to champion this in the EU,
Absolutely.
are you?
One specific idea I took out of the discussion today is this issue of independent measurement of risks and preparedness for risks, and how we can pursue that is something that I can promise this audience I will take back, and we will work on it.
Thank you very much. Minister Kassa.
Well, even though we have been trying to work on the changing environment and put relentless efforts to avert disasters in Africa, still we are not in a position to finance whatever we need to solve our pertinent problems. So this forum created good opportunity for all of us to understand the critical situation in Africa, and it helps us to put hands together to solve our common problems. Particularly, I would like to stress that as we are working in the climate change environment, we have to pay due attention on the climatic change adaptation, because climate change adaptation is a part and parcel of disaster risk reduction and management. So we have to invest more on the disaster risk reduction components so as to cope up with the climate change what we have faced together.
Okay, Lucas Arnoldussen.
Yeah, I think I will put more resources into establishing communication lines with governments of exposed countries, and also continue to establish more contacts with international development banks and also the World Bank in how insurance and reinsurance can play a role in alleviating the problems that we see here. I think there's a big role, and due to climate change taking such a strong effect on natural disasters, I think there's also no time to lose. We have to act soon.
And replicating the Turkish model?
It has been done in the Caribbean, as was mentioned before, and I hope that there's going to be more support also from donor organizations in engaging in things like that, because that's, I think, where the problems lie at the moment. The funding is missing for concepts like this.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks to all our panelists, and thank you very much to the audience. We're out of time. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.